It's easy to look outward and point fingers. It's easy to blame the environment, the people around us, the world for the chaos in our lives. But the far more difficult and far more meaningful question is the one turned inward. Am I the toxic one? That question cuts deeper than any accusation someone else could make because it requires a brutal kind of honesty. It asks us to examine not just the pain we've endured, but the pain we've caused. And if we're truthful, most of us will find that somewhere along the way, we have been both the victim and the perpetrator of toxicity. When we talk about toxic people, we tend to imagine extreme cases, manipulators, narcissists, people who drain the energy out of everyone they meet. But the truth is that toxicity is rarely so dramatic. More often, it shows up in subtle habits, the way we dismiss someone's feelings when we're impatient, the sarcasm we use as a weapon, the bitterness we let seep into every conversation. These are small acts, but they accumulate. They create an atmosphere where trust cannot grow. And if we're not vigilant, we can easily become the very force we resent in others. Psychologically, this makes sense. We are all shaped by wounds, disappointments, and fears. Hurt people often hurt people. If I feel insecure, I might criticize others to feel stronger. If I feel powerless, I might control others to regain a sense of stability. If I feel rejected, I might withdraw or lash out so I don't have to feel that sting again. These are protective strategies, but they come at a cost. They turn us into agents of toxicity without us even realizing it. What feels like self-defense to us can feel like aggression or betrayal to the people closest to us. This is why self-reflection is so crucial. Without it, we become blind to our patterns. We convince ourselves that we are always justified, always the victim, always surrounded by unreasonable people. That narrative is comforting, but it's also deeply dangerous. Because if everyone else is the problem, then we are powerless to change. But if we are at least part of the problem, then we have room to grow. And growth is only possible when we take responsibility for our own behavior. There is also a moral dimension to this. Toxicity isn't just a psychological issue, it's a failure of character. When I choose to act out of bitterness instead of patience, I'm not just making a mistake. I'm building a habit of being the kind of person who poisons relationships. Each choice is a brick laid in the foundation of who I am becoming. If I lie, manipulate, or tear people down, I am wiring myself into that identity. And over time, the cost isn't just damaged relationships, the cost is my own soul. But here's the paradox. Asking, am I the toxic one, is not an act of weakness or self-condemnation. It's an act of strength. Most people avoid the question because it threatens their ego. They would rather maintain the illusion of innocence than face the discomfort of guilt. But courage is the willingness to see things as they are, even when it hurts. When you admit, yes, I have been toxic, you're not disqualifying yourself from redemption. You're opening the door to it because you cannot change what you refuse to confront. And change is always possible. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is plastic. It can rewire itself. Psychology tells us that behavior, once habitual, can be reshaped with intention and discipline. Philosophy tells us that every human being is capable of transformation, but all of that depends on honesty. You can't fix a wound you refuse to acknowledge. You can't repair a relationship while insisting you've done nothing wrong. And you certainly can't grow into your potential while clinging to the comforting lie that you are blameless. So what does it mean in practical terms? It means examining your daily interactions with humility. Ask yourself, do I listen or do I dismiss? Do I encourage or do I criticize? Do I forgive or do I keep score? It means paying attention to the emotional wake you leave behind. After spending time with you, do people feel lighter or heavier, more hopeful or more defeated? Those subtle traces reveal more about your character than your self-image ever could. None of this is easy. Looking in the mirror rarely is, but there's immense freedom in it. Because once you admit your flaws, you no longer have to hide them. You can confront them, work on them, and over time transform them. And that transformation not only changes you, it ripples outward. A person who was once toxic can become a source of healing. A voice that once spread bitterness can begin to speak life. A presence that once drained others can begin to strengthen them. That is the power of honest self-reflection. So the question lingers, am I the toxic one? If the answer is yes, it doesn't mean you're condemned. It means you have work to do, and that work is noble. Because by taking responsibility for the chaos you've created, you also gain the power to create peace. And perhaps that is the real measure of maturity, not whether you avoid ever being toxic, but whether you have the courage to recognize it when you are and the discipline to change. Because at the end of the day, the world doesn't need more people who are blind to their flaws. It needs people brave enough to confront their own darkness so they can become a light to others. So the challenge I leave you with is this: stop asking, who around me is toxic? Start asking, where am I the toxic one? And then decide here and now that you will no longer let your weaknesses dictate your identity. Because the moment you take ownership of your darkness, you also gain the power to transform it into light.